Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody. So today we've got an all-star ABL lineup. Going to hear from Ken, Ben, and Tasha, all from Penn State. And I won't take any time at all. I'll just hand it over to Ken to kick us off.
All righty. Thanks, everyone. So we are going to try to give you a story about atmospheric measurements, not all the atmospheric measurements for Baltimore, but a subset of them, which Penn State is working on. And so I thought that a way we could motivate this for the folks who are not boundary layer meteorologists, which is most of us, is thinking of this as the river of air that we need to measure, the river of air that we live in. How deep is it? How fast is it flowing? And how are we going to do that? So intro, I'll do an intro. What's the boundary layer? Why do we care? Why should we make measurements in Baltimore? Then I'm going to hand over to Tasha and Ben for some other parts, and then I'll try to close it up. So what's the boundary layer? The boundary layer, this is a classic picture from one of the texts we use a lot, Stull 88. The boundary layer is the air that is in contact with the Earth's surface, the shaded areas. And this one overemphasizes the depth at night. This is night and day. Daytime boundary layer is often about 10 times deeper than the nighttime boundary layer. So the layer of air in contact with the surface varies a lot as a function of time of day. And we'll refer to this as the ABL, atmospheric boundary layer. Classic picture is to look at a mysterious quantity called virtual potential temperature, which I won't try to explain. But this is, think of it as temperature versus altitude above ground. So this is 500, 1,000, 2,000 meters. And you see close to the ground, this is first thing in the morning. It's cold at the ground and it gets warm fast as you go up. This is stable conditions. You don't get much mixing in a condition like this. If we go to the afternoon, and this is from the same day later in the day, blue is the data, red was a model that our students were building for class. You see the change from blue to blue as you go from morning, to afternoon. So by the afternoon, things have warmed up and it's well mixed, a very deep convective turbulent layer. So a huge change from this condition to this condition every day. That's typical. So why does this matter? Well, here's some aircraft measurements from colleagues from long-term colleagues, Paul Sheps and Obi Kambaliza, who are at Purdue now. Paul has moved down to Stony Brook. This is another view of that daytime convective layer. You notice it's a lot shallower, it's in the springtime, but it's 500 meters of well-mixed air. And if you look at what you could call these pollutants or just gases, things like water or methane that are emitted to the surface, they accumulate in that low layer. So they pile up in that layer of air. So the thickness of that river, the depth of that box makes a big difference. If you want to know how warm it's going to be, how cold it's going to get, how much pollution is going to be in the air, are there going to be clouds or rain, you have to know the depth of the ABL. You have to know the wind speed and direction in the ABL. So how deep is the river of air? How fast is it flowing? Where did it come from? Are questions we have to answer. Why do we need to measure in Baltimore? This is the national balloon launching network. Twice a day, balloons are launched at each one of these places. You know, Baltimore's here. There is a sounding location at Dulles Airport, not too far away, but it's certainly not Baltimore. And the urban surface modifies the boundary layer. It modifies the river of air that we're in. So we need measurements that are specific to the city to understand the air of the city. There's the pitch, the intro pitch. I'm going to just take a breather. Any questions on the intro pitch?
And I don't want to get too technical here.
Sure.
But just for those who are not atmospheric scientists, I know you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of virtual potential temperature,
Yeah.
but just so people understand that, potential temperature and why, what it really means to see potential temperature, have a vertical line like that. Can you just describe a little?
Yeah, you could think of it, the old term that says, warm air rises and cold air sinks. Well, that's not quite correct. It has to be warm enough. The virtual potential temperature corrects for the heating and cooling of air as it expands and contracts with altitude. So if you look at this quantity, then you can say warm air rises and cold air sinks. That's what the purpose of this. It's a thermodynamic adjustment for the changes in temperature that happen with altitude, because as you go up in the air, pressure drops, air expands, and it'll cool off by adding no energy or removing no energy from the air. So if you look at this quantity, you can say, warm air, that's going to rise. Or cold air, that's going to sink. So that cold air near the ground is very stable.
And sorry for the question. To what extent the presence of buildings would affect the depth of the river that you mentioned?
It does. And to what extent? Here's a cartoon from a textbook. This is a topic that is not measured a lot for a long time in lots of cities at this point. This is partly why we're in business.
Thank you.
But in general, you expect this urban surface to be hotter and drier, and the rural area to be colder and more moist, so that you might get more vigorous convection and deeper boundary layers over the cities. There's one first shot. The so-called urban heat island influences the boundary layer. Okay, I'm going to move along. So there's two kinds of measurements. Part of them we're not going to talk about. Penn State isn't working so much on these, though we're in touch with you all, of course. And I've referred to these as the impact measurements. These are the measurements of the things that we want to know because they impact health and welfare. And we want to be able to measure them, see if we can simulate them, and then see if our models can simulate them, we can help envision the future of Baltimore. And these are, for our project, the Search AQ network and the neighborhood level temperature, relative humidity, precipitation measurements. These enhance existing networks and tell us the air quality and the microclimate and the precip where people live, which is what we want to know. And what our goal is to add resolution so that we can get neighborhood level scale resolution within Baltimore. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what I've been calling the process measurements. And so we're going to go a couple layers into why. These are measurements of the atmospheric conditions. We need to understand the impact variables, like the person level climate and air quality. We have to get these process quantities right so that we get the right answers for the right reasons. And if we get these processes right, then our simulations are going to be more robust when we extrapolate to future climate and management. This is the list of measurements. I'm not going to describe it right now. We're going to go through this one at a time. But another way to put this in a picture is, and I've been motivated by our XLRM discussions. And, we're building the relationships, urban atmosphere and land surface models, Department of Energy, but these are under construction. We're learning how to make them work. We want to simulate future climate and assist with mitigation and adaptation, but we have to build and test the models. So we need the measurements to develop and test these systems. So next, the tour of measurements. First, the scanning Doppler LiDAR, and I'm going to turn it over at this point to Tasha.
Okay, thanks, Ken. First, apologies for all these words, but hopefully it won't be too bad. The LiDAR, it stands for light detection and ranging, and it works similar to a radar, except that instead of radio waves, the LiDAR uses light that's either in the visible or infrared portion of the spectrum. And the Doppler part of the name, it refers to using the Doppler shift of the light that's reflected back to the instrument to get the wind speeds. And we measure both the wind speed and the turbulence. And the amount of energy that's reflected back to the instrument provides information about the aerosol content. So we're able to get that information as well. It consists of a laser transmitter and a telescope to receive and record the light. And we plan to point the instrument vertically to get the atmospheric boundary layer depth, the vertical velocity variance, the cloud base height and cloud fraction, and the aerosol content, but we'll also scan the LiDAR. So we'll point it at an angle away from vertical in order to be able to get the horizontal winds. And the plan is to deploy the LiDAR in July of, well, next month.
Next month.
Here's a photo. This is from our colleagues at NOAA who have a Doppler LiDAR in Washington, DC, and we are going to be copying their deployment and their data analysis methods. And we've worked a lot with their data that they've collected in Indianapolis, where we have a project. And so we're familiar with the data set and what we can do with it. Here's a map of Baltimore. The plan is to deploy the LiDAR on a rooftop on Morgan State University. And then depending on how the power works out, we may end up moving to Clifton Park High School, depending on how things go. Here's an example from NOAA's LiDAR in DC. This is the aerosol backscatter signal strength. That's the different colors. We have the x-axis is time going for a 24-hour period. And the pink line is the boundary layer depth. So you can see, I put the local time here at the bottom. So it starts at around evening time, 7 p.m. The first evening, and then you can see the boundary layer depth is really low. And then it's low throughout the night. And then as soon as you hit morning around 7 a.m., it starts increasing, and then it's highest in the afternoon before it collapses again in the evening hours. And then the vertical velocity variance is what we have here. You can see this kind of picks up the boundary layer depth a little better than the backscatter did in the previous plot. Yeah, you can see the pattern there. And then the next one is the wind speed and direction. So we get that information as well.
Yeah, these plots are maddening, but this is north, south, east, west direction. I think the color is speed. Every little arrow is a different measurement.
So to kind of sum up that part, Ken has already defined that the atmospheric boundary layer depth is the depth to which the things are mixed in the atmosphere. And so it answers the question, how deep is the river? We often call this variable H. And the wind velocity is a function of altitude in the atmosphere. We also get that information, and that answers the question, how fast is the river flowing? And we call this M. And we also know which direction it's flowing. And these information together gives us the ventilation factor or the residence time for anything that's introduced from the Earth's surface. So it could be heat, pollutants, water vapor. And so this ventilation factor, H times M, is when it's large. So that when the river is deep and the wind speed is high, the pollutants are transported out of the area quickly. Or ventilated rapidly. And so any pollutants you have or heat or water vapor don't accumulate very much. But the opposite is true when you have a shallow river or the wind speed is low. And so with the Doppler LiDAR, we're able to measure this continuously. And we also simulate the HM with our atmospheric models. So we can compare, do a model data comparison. And this is critical to testing our ability to get the right answer for the right reason. So the plan is to operate the LiDAR for the duration of BSEC. We'll create a continuous record of the atmospheric winds, cloud cover, boundary layer depth, aerosols over the city to support our understanding of the Baltimore climate. And these instruments are pretty rare. We're only aware of one other long-term deployment of such an instrument for urban climate in North America. And that's the one that we talked about a little bit previously that was in Indianapolis for about 4 years, and then it was moved to DC pretty recently. Okay, some examples of the model data comparison from Indianapolis. Here we have day of year on the x-axis going for a whole year for 2016, and the y-axis is the atmospheric boundary layer depth. And it's broken up into season, and you can see there's a pretty big seasonal pattern here, with it being the boundary layer depth is higher in the summer. And then the different colors are, the blue is the LiDAR, and then the orange and the yellow are different estimates of the boundary layer depth from the WRF model.
Oops. There you go.
And this is the daytime wind speeds, which we can also do a model data comparison of. Here, the LiDAR is blue and the model is red. And different seasons, this is for the wind speed as a function of height. And you can see the winter is about twice as windy as the summer. And you can see the model does pretty well, not as good near the surface though. Okay, so to conclude, we're really excited about the Doppler LiDAR. They tell us the depth of the river of air that we live in, where it is flowing and how fast it's flowing. We also get an estimate of the aerosol content and how vigorous the turbulent mixing is. And it's continuous in time. So we're very excited about that.
Right. Thanks, Tasha. So this is really cool. I think I got to pause here in case anybody has questions about this measurement or these arguments.
So thanks for that. The model does not seem to be doing as well near the surface. Is that because we are not resolving the friction component well? How, or do the measurements degrade as you get to the surface because the travel time, the return time of the backscatter is much smaller? And does it at all approach a detection, measurement precision?
I don't think we're having trouble with measurement precision or quality. It may be representativeness since it's very close to the surface and the LiDAR is in a particular place. But it's probably more likely that the modeled surface layer is not doing what we want it to. And we don't really know how to fix it yet. That's work in progress, Larry.
Great. And M is depth integrated, I presume. It's some sort of an integrated mean. Your N value that you're giving.
These values are averages over the entire month for midday conditions.
Right, but when you say you have HM, that's similar to specificity in hydrology. So M is the depth integrated.
Yeah, you know, truly, we wouldn't use just a depth integrated number. We'd calculate this at every point in space and time with the model. So just using that to illustrate the concept.
Great.
I see Peter's hand. Peter, speak.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I came late. So if this was covered, just tell me to be quiet. But is there some general sense about how urbanization affects the thickness, height, heterogeneity, ventilation of the boundary layer?
Yes.
And if there is some sense of what the urban effect is, might that be a target for restoration, right? So like, you know, if we do enough greening,
yes,
could we push the boundary layer back towards what it is in its natural condition?
Yes, we did mention this, but it's worth repeating. So yes, in fact, Peter, we expect, and you're queuing it up for Ben, who's coming next. We expect that the urban surface has higher sensible heat flux and lower latent heat flux. To put it simply, is hotter and drier than the rural surroundings, so that the mixing is more vigorous over the urban system and the river of air is deeper. Further, the urban surface is probably rougher than the smoother rural surroundings. You could argue with that, but that could be the case. And so even at night when the sun isn't out, the mixing over the city might be more vigorous. And if you were to modify the urban surface to make it more vegetated or smoother, you could change that. In fact, yes, you'll change the temperature, you'll change the mixing. And we need the measurements to see if what we think should happen is really going to happen. That's exactly what we're after. So right on the money.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
All right, so scanning Doppler LiDARs are cool, but we are not satisfied. This is not good enough. We want to know not just the why of the boundary layer to understand if we get the urban climate right for the right reason, but we want to know if we get the boundary layer right for the right reason. Why is H what it is, and why is the wind speed what it is? So we need more measurements for that. I'll be quick with the radio sondes. These are just balloon-borne measurements. They measure wind, temperature, water. We don't measure water and temperature with the LiDAR. It'd be lovely if we could do that continuously with remote sensing, but we don't have the budget for that. And so what we're going to do is launch balloons about once a week, just as a check on our modeling systems. That should be enough to see if we're in the right ballpark with the modeling systems. We hope that we can partner with Morgan State to get them to help us launch the sondes from near the LiDAR site. So that's about all I'm going to say about that. We will have some instrumented balloon launches to help us get the top of the boundary layer, the thermodynamic part, this potential temperature and water. Getting back though to what Peter asked about, how does the urban surface modify things? This is where the flux towers show up. These are the quantities, these measure what the things that drive the turbulence. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ben Ahlswede, who just joined our group working on the BSEC project. Ben, floor is yours.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so the way I think about this, as Ken just talked about, so the Doppler LiDAR, as far as I can tell, I'm new to that instrument. Basically, it's observations of what is the boundary layer doing. The radio sondes is getting some characteristics, some atmospheric characteristics of what's going on in the boundary layer, what's going on in the air. But the surface has a big impact on what is going on in the boundary layer. So we need to make observations of the surface, and in an urban area, that means observations of the urban surface. So there's two big important factors, as Ken highlighted here. There's the drag, literally like the air is rubbing along the surface of the earth, and that slows the wind speed down, inducing some kind of turbulence into the air. And also the heating factor. This is happening everywhere, but particularly in urban areas, that's important because of all the concrete and mirror and windows and things that absorb heat. And also there's less trees, so heat is dissipated less readily. So flux towers are kind of the most appropriate tool for this, because it basically is observations of the surface, but at the interface between the surface and the atmosphere. And we can measure incoming and outgoing radiation measurements, as well as other stuff. And I'm going to get into that a little bit. So I'm going to attempt to briefly explain what eddy covariance is doing. Okay, so in an ideal world, whatever system we're interested in, if we wanted to measure the flux of something, energy, carbon, water, what have you, we would put a big box around the whole thing, and we would measure what's coming in, and we would measure what's going out. And then we could say, oh, okay, great, this is the flux of things. In a natural system, or in a system that's not, this is what you would do on a leaf. If anyone's ever used a Lycor, you can actually encapsulate a leaf and measure the flux of carbon from a leaf, but we can't encapsulate a forest, and we certainly can't encapsulate a city to measure the flux of things. Luckily, there's a technique called eddy covariance that allows us to measure the flux of whatever thing you're interested in, with some assumptions and some very high precision measurements. So basically what we have is the basic instrument is a 3D sonic anemometer, and it measures the turbulence and movement of air in a very high frequency way. And so if there's wind moving across the surface, there's going to be some kind of vertical component to that. The big assumption in eddy covariance to get an area measurement from a point source is that what's crossing the instrument is the same as what's leaving the instrument. Basically, what's coming in is the same as what's going out, and any difference is what's happening vertically between the surface and the atmosphere, and that's what we're interested in. So we have a sonic anemometer pictured up here on the top right, with the thing with the three prongs there, and that measures the 3D movement of air at a very high frequency, 20 hertz for that particular instrument, but they can go higher. And then we compare that with also very high frequency measurements of whatever substance you're particularly interested in. In this case, my example plot is an infrared gas analyzer that measures carbon and water. So if we go to the bottom thing here, we have, let's say at time 1, we have the air moving in a downward direction paired with the measurement, the carbon amount at that particular time. And then at time 2, we have the air moving in a different direction upwards in this case, and then we have a different carbon measurement. And if we co-vary those two measurements, you can essentially infer the movement of that substance in and out of the surface of the system, you know, wherever you've placed your sonic anemometer in your ergo. And it results in a results plot over here on the bottom right. This is all taken straight from the eddy covariance book by George Burba, where you can see in the topmost plot, this is a nighttime CO2 release signal, where the wind is moving in a downward direction, and so is the CO2. Okay, so there's more CO2 above the system than there is below the system. Did I say that right? Sometimes I get this backwards. CO2 is moving, when the wind's moving down and the CO2 value is increasing as the wind's moving down, that means the CO2 is higher above the system than is below the system.
Yeah. Might
And
be
then the opposite is true on the, yeah, so basically, so yeah, this is the part where I sort of lose people sometimes, but essentially, if they're moving together, like in the plot shows, CO2 is being released from the surface, and if the wind and CO2 are moving separately, that means there's uptake happening. So a lot of the assumptions that we need for eddy covariance is not necessarily connected to the technique. It's more about what do we infer from these measurements. So there's a lot of things that could lead to a loss of CO2 at the surface. If we set up our site correctly, then those things are going to be hopefully photosynthesis in the most case. That's mostly what eddy covariance is set up to do. So slide. So here's an example of some results from sites that we manage. On the left-hand side is in INC, it's an influx site, and you can see a little picture of it there on the bottom left. So this is a urban tower. That tower in the photo is where the instruments are actually mounted, and there's downtown Indianapolis in the background. That's on the left-hand side. And then on the other side, on the right-hand side, is the SSH site, Shale Hills, and this is obviously a very heavily forested site. And these are both managed by us, and I should mention that Fan Wu and Jason Horn prepared the data and made these plots of the daily diurnal cycle. So, for example, and we're going to be getting this exact type of data from Baltimore, where we're going to be getting measurements of sensible heat flux, or H. I'm using my mouse and I can't point. H on the top row, where, for example, so hypothetically, we might see something like this in Baltimore. The sensible heat flux in the Indiana site is very similar to the sensible heat flux from the forested site. But the big difference is how much latent heat flux there is. And at the urban site, there's some latent heat flux. That's the movement of energy through evaporated water. There's not that much evaporated water happening at Indianapolis, but there's a lot of water evaporating in the forested site. And you can see that the nice big curve. This is a diurnal curve, so you can see in the middle of the day, we see a lot of movement of water facilitated by trees. There's probably more water in general because trees have been there for a long time, et cetera, et cetera. And this is that process I think Peter Groffman was kind of talking about. It's the ratio of these two energies is called the Bowen ratio. And essentially, if you have more sensible heat flux relative to latent heat flux, you're going to end up with a deeper, drier boundary layer. And if you have more latent heat flux, it's shallower and cooler. And that leads to downstream things. We also measure other things. So on the top row here, again, we have Indianapolis on the left and Shale Hills on the right. This is a measure of friction velocity, which is basically how turbulent is the air over those two systems. And I've never looked at urban sites before I came to this project. And so I was really interested in this Indianapolis flux one. So this is hypothetically what we might see in Baltimore as well, where we see lower friction velocity at night, which, you know, the lower wind speeds, there's less temperature, so things are less turbulent. That makes sense. And then it increases during the day, and then it again decreases during the night. You see the same pattern again over the Shale Hills site, where you have lower friction velocity at night, higher friction velocity during the day, and then decreasing. What I think is kind of interesting is that the maximum friction velocity measured between these two systems is about the same, but the minimum is quite different, where we actually have higher turbulence at the urban site at nighttime, Indianapolis compared to Shale Hills. That again could contribute to an urban heat island effect, because that increased turbulence is going to be bringing in warm air from the atmosphere down onto the surface layer. We also measure carbon flux, which isn't terribly important for boundary layer dynamics, but it's interesting from an ecologist perspective. So here on the left, Indianapolis is clearly emitting a bunch of carbon in the middle of the day. There's probably some biological signal here too, bringing that emission signal down, but clearly not enough to overcome whatever respiration or your tailpipe emissions or power plants, or whatever we're measuring in there. As opposed to the Shale Hill site, where we see a big negative CO2 flux indicating CO2 uptake, from the perspective of the atmosphere. And then more or less zero at nighttime. Yeah, go ahead, Ken, thank you. Okay, so here's again our map of Baltimore. This is a figure prepared again by Jason Horn, where we have a map of the current sited Doppler LiDAR, the SODAR, we'll get to that, and the 2 flux tower sites. On the right-hand side is Flux Tower. We're calling that one Broadway East. It's in a pretty highly densely neighborhood, pretty high density population of Baltimore. Lots of row houses, lots of concrete, not a lot of grass. And on the western side is the Howard Park Flux Tower, or Howard Park neighborhood. That is still a pretty high density, but I'd call it like maybe medium density. There are some single family homes, but they're very close together. There are more trees. There's a lot of green space. So these are both pretty densely populated areas. It's definitely not suburbia out there on Howard Park. These are 2 densely populated areas, one of which has a lot more green space than the other one, and trees in particular. And I think I have some pictures coming up next of what these are going to look like. Great. So this is Broadway East. We're mounting these on existing cell phone towers rather than constructing our own towers, which is a little more space and cost efficient. So this is an image courtesy of Google Maps. The tower itself is 32 meters high, thank you. And it is situated right underneath the right arrow, the right side of this arrow, yeah. So, and we have a meter here, the arrow meter is about 500 meters and pointing to the west of where the tower is sited. Based on experience about predominant wind directions and the height of the instruments, we think that's about the fetch, that's about the area that we're going to be sampling with the flux instrument. And you can see from the picture, it's pretty, sorry, go back one. There is a lot of grass, but there's dense buildings, a lot of concrete. Compared to the next one, go ahead, Ken. This is the Howard Park neighborhood. You see these single family homes. It's tower height's a little bit taller, and you can already see in this picture some nice big trees nearish to the tower. Next slide. Yeah, and then again, same with the instruments are going to be situated at approximately the same altitude, like elevation. So we're going to be sampling about the same size. And you compare in your head, I guess it may be a side-by-side would have been good for this, but this is a much greener, less dense neighborhood. So this is what, and the idea behind this experimental design is that we could essentially turn Broadway East into this type neighborhood, you know, with the right policies and whatnot. But this is the test. So why are we making these measurements? So, well, in order to simulate, you know, the boundary layer in Baltimore, we need to use models to do so. And that has a land surface model component. And in those land surface models, these fluxes that contribute to boundary layer dynamics are simulated and they're prescribed. But measurements of those types of fluxes are really not very common, especially in urban areas. Due to the diversity and the difficulty logistically of doing it. They're much more common in forested type areas, but they're research grade instruments. They're not the kind of thing you're going to find on a regular weather station. I sort of mentioned this already, but yeah, so vegetated surfaces, we anticipate, we know that they evaporate more water than built or impervious type surfaces, and that could contribute to the urban heat island. That therefore makes the atmospheric boundary layer deeper, and then in increasing that surface roughness, and then that entrains more hot air, and then so the next day is hotter, and this is like a positive feedback loop that contributes to the urban heat island effect. We could also use these towers to evaluate or you know, we're going to train the models using the flux tower observations, but we can also, just through our observations, evaluate some solution pathways, such as what happens if we green up the space, if we plant more trees, or what happens if we paint everybody's roof becomes, a mirror. We paint everybody's roof white now. Those two processes basically just change the surface energy balance at the surface. We can simulate that, but we don't know if we're getting it right at all, particularly in urban environments. The surface energy models that I'm familiar with do very well in forested areas or agricultural type areas, but urban land surface modeling is very simple and rudimentary in most systems. Next slide. So our plans, we have those two towers sited. We're developing leases and permissions to get our instruments up on those towers. We're going to deploy there for 2 years. We're going to confront our land surface models with those observations as we go. And then we're going to redeploy those instruments at 2 different sites for 2 more years. Those sites have yet to be chosen. We're going to base those decisions on what we find at the first 2 and any ongoing scientific questions from the group. So interestingly, because flux towers exist at the interface between surface, like the ecosystem, and the atmosphere, it essentially integrates almost everything that BSEC is doing, where it's making observations of both the surface and the atmosphere. So it kind of is a connection point between anything like the veg and soil group or the urban hydrology and the atmospheric dynamic groups is doing. So hopefully everybody's going to be interested in these measurements.
So thank you, Ben. So at this point, we hope we've made the pitch that we will be measuring the river, its depth, its speed, and measurements we need to understand what it's doing, even if we modify the surface, or if folks say, let's do the following to the surface, we'll have data to help guide our understanding. So this is another good point to pause and see if anybody has any questions. We got a little more we could tell you, but that's the core of the story. There's a few things I can add if there's time.
So question about the tower flux measurement in an urban area that's very heterogeneous. It's either an implicit assumption or there has to be correction for divergence in the horizontal, in the advective transport, I presume. So you show the example for the eastern site. To the east, there's a large park. Now, it'll be a little bit more rare to have wind speeds coming out of the east dominantly, but how much variability first is there because of the footprint shifting around with meteorological conditions? And how much correction do you need to do because of the heterogeneity of the system? So you might have, you need to resolve the advective fluxes coming in.
Thanks. So Larry, so do you want to go for that, Ben, or do you want me to?
Yeah, well, we can both chime in. So yeah,
Take a shot.
for one, you're absolutely right. So when the wind's coming from a different direction, we're kind of sampling a different system, but we're still interested in that system because there are parks in Baltimore, and so they all contribute to the total flux of the urban system. That's one thing. And the second thing is we can be careful. We just have to be careful in how we interpret things. We probably shouldn't just blindly say, everything's good. We know exactly what we're looking at all the time. We do a wind direction breakdown of what the fluxes are looking like coming from different directions. As far as advective losses, I'm actually personally not that concerned about it. Ken might have other thoughts, but we actually are a little bit lucky in the urban environment because advective losses typically happen in topography, where at nighttime the air will settle and you'll see CO2 being like, you'll see photosynthesis happening at nighttime because essentially the air is sinking and CO2 is going down the hill. I don't think we're going to see that too much in Baltimore because of one, we get a little bit extra roughness, and two, it's pretty flat relatively to other type systems that I've been in. So Ken, do you have anything you want to add on top of that?
A little bit. I agree with you that I don't think we're going to have those advective losses that we see in stable conditions much. And we do routinely measure conditions below the tower so that if it's a vertical accumulation issue, we can try to quantify the flux divergence directly. The horizontal loss is really limited typically to stable conditions. And I don't think we'll have it much.
Could we,
For the footprints, if I can go back to that, we'll do better than wind direction. We can actually convolve a flux footprint with a map of the specific surfaces. So if we can develop land surface models that resolve building to building, yard to yard, we can lay the flux half hour by half hour right over that specific surface. We don't have to have it be homogeneous. We've done this. We can nail it. We are the experts at this.
so that actually that could be a nice signal, because we could have the land surface process models operating at sufficient resolution, so we could see
Exactly.
differences in the footprint. Great.
You betcha.
It indicates we might want to also periodically, under different conditions, just measure some land surface properties, soil moisture and so forth in different parts of the landscape.
You
So
betcha.
it's possible there'll be some persistently wetter parts and drier parts.
Yeah, we would love to be able to work on developing the land surface models down to like 10-meter resolution, especially around these towers, because we can interrogate them down to tens of meter resolution with these measurements.
Great.
Are you sure you want to move them after 2 years? I know that we went through this with NEON. I was on the NEON Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee.
Yeah.
And you know, they were going to move a bunch of towers. When it came down to it, you know, they're producing these things are going to be producing super interesting data. And I wonder, do we have some flexibility to move one or to not move them, or
I think we do have flexibility. Yes. What we told you is the plan we put in the proposal was to get, 4 different sites in order to get more representation of the land surface. If we decide instead, or our community partners say, hey, we want more time at these sites, we could make that decision.
And Larry and I are asking a lot of questions because we've been dreaming about flux towers in Baltimore for long. We're very excited.
We like that. That's good. Okay, I'm going to move along. There's a little more. I'll describe briefly a couple more measurements and then a proposal. Baltimore is a coastal city. There's probably a bay breeze or a sea breeze that's going to confound the stories we've been telling you about the river of air in the city. Because if you get these thermal gradients like land and sea, you get breezes that go back and forth. And so we're going to put a second wind profiler along the coast to see if we can pick out when these breezes happen and whether or not our models pick it up. And this is a SODAR. It's like LIDAR, but with sound. It's sound detection and ranging. If we had the money, we'd probably just get another LIDAR, but we have a SODAR, thanks to Scott Richardson. We actually had 2, but we're going to just refurbish one, put it at the coast. It measures horizontal winds and turbulence, similar technology as the LIDAR, but with sound, but only up to a couple hundred meters above ground, which should be sufficient to capture things like a bay breeze. So here's up to 200 meters reflectivity from the SODAR for a short period of time, and that same kind of horizontal wind plot that we had for the LIDAR. Data about every 5 meters and about every 5 to 10 minutes. And this thing is headed tentatively for somewhere down around here, just so we can pick up, hey, there's wind is coming off the bay now. Do we get this? And how are our models doing? Because that's going to influence the conditions close to the bay. How far in, we're not sure. Surface layer turbulence is another thing we're going to be measuring. So this gets back to Larry was saying, hey, what's up with that data down near the ground where the winds aren't right? So just knowing the whole boundary layer isn't enough. People live at the ground. And if you look at these soundings, the temperature at the ground is not the same as the temperature in the whole river, especially at night. It changes very strongly with altitude. This is temperature, but other quantities like pollutants would have similar patterns potentially. So each one of the flux towers is going to have a tree of turbulence, relative humidity, and temperature measurements below the flux measurement level. And this is Ying Pan's work. She'll be doing this as part of the Penn State team. And so just to give you a picture, imagine we're measuring the eddy covariance flux here. We'll have measurements all the way down to person level so that we can see how well our models do or don't capture that surface layer, so we can translate the boundary layer into person level conditions. Models may or may not do a good job of that. That's a tough job, especially in a city. And then last, what about the neighbors? Right? Baltimore's not on its own. The river of air comes from somewhere. And while we like to study the urban system, it may be that we have problems simulating Baltimore because we don't simulate the neighbors very well. So we put in a proposal to DOE's atmospheric radiation measurement program to deploy their mobile facility. Now, don't get it wrong. It doesn't drive around. Mobile means they'll stick it somewhere for a year and then they'll pick it up and stick it somewhere else for a year. That's mobile. So we asked them to put their mobile facility to address this regional heterogeneity issue. It has a lot of instrumentation. It also gets into cloud microphysics and atmospheric composition and interactions with radiation. And one of our colleagues from New York came up with this really cool acronym, COURAGE, the Coastal Urban Rural Atmospheric Gradient Experiment. And so we would beef up our measurements in Baltimore, add an ancillary site in rural Maryland. This is a hypothetical location. We'd add another ancillary site in the Bay to get Bay conditions. And then we'll use Beltsville and DC measurements to get our urban upwind, potential urban upwind boundary conditions. So we've got Baltimore and all the neighbors measured pretty well with these sorts of properties. And that's the complicated figure we put in the proposal, which I won't walk you through. That's all of our story. Thank you. Any remaining questions?
What do we know about the length scale of the boundary layer in urban areas? So we'll have a sounding from the LiDAR vertically. We'll do some scanning. Will we be able to resolve structure, horizontal heterogeneity to the structure? Or do we know much about that? So we'll see potentially a deeper boundary layer in the urban area because of the difference in Bowen ratios. But over that heterogeneous landscape,
We are
is the
not,
length scale of these in terms of significant differences, hundreds of meters, kilometers?
well, there's a couple of questions in there. Let me try to pull them apart. We will get information about the length scales of turbulence from the LiDAR, because you can, and actually from the flux towers, because you can take those turbulence data and do spectral analysis to say, the eddies are this big, the eddies are this big, and this is how it changes with time. And so we'll have that at these two towers close to the ground, but then the LiDAR pointing up can get you this information higher up in the atmosphere. We don't have multiple atmospheric soundings within the city to see, is it different in this part of the city compared to this part of the city compared to this part of the city? The best we could come to that, I think, is to have something like the ARM proposal funded, where we would have the Bay and the countryside compared to the city.
Plus the WRF model will give some spatially resolved
And the model will attempt to simulate these properties,
heights.
but it typically doesn't
Okay.
simulate the turbulence explicitly. Turbulence in the mesoscale model is usually parametrized, and parametrized, I like to tell my students, is a polite word for we tell lies to approximate things we can't really simulate properly. We could run a large eddy simulation to try to simulate the turbulence explicitly, but we can only do that for short periods of time in relatively smaller areas, but we can do that for tests. So you could imagine a large eddy simulation test of the question you're asking, and we could pin it down at points with these measurements to make sure we're not, looking at simulating something bogus. And then potentially, if we get a great land surface model, we could do LES for a big chunk of the city to see how much spatial variability we expect to find across the city in the turbulence.
one more question. What can the measurements and potentially the modeling tell us about the potential for very deep convection, where we're going to start getting some of these supercell developments for pluvial flooding, or just thunderstorm development in general, or is that beyond our capacity at this point?
No, that's in there. If we can describe the urban surface well with the flux towers and land surface models, we should be able to simulate how that alters processes like, does the city cause convection to initiate? We should be able to test that. Absolutely. Chris.
Yeah, hi. Lots of interesting things to think about. And I'm curious about the horizontal heterogeneity where the flux towers are. What's the scale of the surfaces in terms of the building structures? And are we talking about hundreds of meters for like an open field? Or are we talking about, in the middle of a building system?
Well, if you remember if you saw the maps looking down from above, there was an arrow across those, which is 500 meters long. And so within that 500 meters, you saw a few blocks.
Okay.
So there's my answer. The scales of the structures of the city appear to be organized with streets, which are, 50 meters, 70 meters apart. And so you've got that patchwork, which is smaller than the flux footprint. So each flux measurement will integrate over a bunch of those blocks, but not evenly. We need a footprint model to try to weight it properly, which we can do. So we should be measuring not one backyard, but a bunch of backyards and streets with each flux measurement, but a bunch being, 5 or 6.
Okay. And in terms of the orientation of the streets, the same issue has to come into play. We'd sort of have longer length scales if it's along the street versus if it's going across the street.
We'd get more if the blocks are stretched out one way versus the other, we'd measure across more blocks one way than the other. Yes. They didn't look quite that routine from the map that I looked at, but yeah. The flux tower probably won't care. It'll see about the same distance any direction. And so if the structures underneath it have some isotropy to them, you're going to measure different numbers of samples with each wind direction.
My default is that there's no isotropy given the scope of the
anisotropy, I should have said.
Anisotropy. Okay.
Yeah, we can make a flux footprint that maps onto the actual surface. We don't have to approximate what's under there. But we did pick it out so that we'd be sampling over something that looks, quasi-homogeneous maybe, if you back up and say, it's a neighborhood.
Since there's a little silence, I would ask also about the other substances that I was putting in the chat. The ozone or the air quality issues. Is it possible to put up something that would be measuring that in the vicinity of the flux tower, or how would that be handled?
In general, I would argue that if it's like the person level air quality and microclimate, it doesn't have to be right at the tower. That we need it spread around the neighborhoods, and we're getting the land atmosphere interactions at the towers that we would put into the models to help describe the spatial structures. If you want to measure a flux of some chemical species, that could be done. If you add that fast response chemical species measurement to our instrument array, then with the sonic anemometer, we could give you the turbulent flux in the vertical and in the horizontal, to be honest.
Thank you. Yep.
Sure. We're thinking about doing that with methane. We'd like to measure methane flux because city distribution of gas is leaky. And that's not really a BSEC thing. That's more of a NIST thing, but we hope we get funds to put methane up next to the CO2 and water. We'd love to put CO up because then we could disaggregate the biogenic and the anthropogenic CO2 if we had a CO flux measurement. That's a wish, not a plan.
Could you comment, Ken or Tasha or Ben, about how we can most effectively complement the tower and the, vertically pointing instruments with surface field campaigns? So, obviously that we're talking about, Megan's gonna be doing some leaf level stuff. We've got people talking about chambers and all of this. Like, what's the best way for us to approach that strategic conversation?
I think we should launch and maintain a discussion of land surface modeling, because as Ben pointed out, this cuts across a bunch of our groups. These are great places to test land surface models, but it's not one discipline that's involved. And as Larry was saying, if we can come up with spatially detailed maps of these processes, we can test them. Then we can ask, what resolution is important. But to test the models under the flux towers, you need the data to feed into the models. So our field measurements ideally would be designed to inform the models we need to describe the land atmosphere fluxes. And then the flux tower is like it's an independent check. It's not driving the models, it's measuring something that your model is predicting to see if you're getting the right answers. We started to have those discussions, but I think we need more. Not like we need more meetings, but I think we need more meetings. It's okay. It's a complicated project. It's fun.
Well, speaking of that, we're at the hour.
Wait, can I jump in? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Ben, go ahead.
To jump on your question.
Yeah.
I mean, as the flux tower kind of person, I mean, I obviously think it's interesting to have subsamples of, if you're taking flux measurements or if you're doing ET, from sap flow or whatever you're doing from the flux footprint, I think is obviously going to be useful, because then we get a check too, and in a way that's sort of what that can disentangle some of the heterogeneity they were talking about. But also, I mean, so I think we've been pretty public about where these towers are going and what we're sampling. So that information's out there. But interestingly, we said we're going to redeploy these too. But we could use those field campaigns to find somewhere interesting. It's that that's not being sampled by the flux towers, and then we can put them there if need be. We can find interesting out groups as well. So
it's also an interesting point. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We will have more meetings to discuss all of this, but this is just a fantastic resource, both today and also as a recording we'll have for others as they join the team. So appreciate everybody. We will see you all soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.